It looks like the number of participants has remained steady for a little bit, so I am just going to go ahead and get us started. So first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is just some tips on viewing. The best option is to do side-by-side mode. Here's the link, and it's also in the chat box to watch using closed captioning. We are going to have 2 question and answer sections during this presentation. One about halfway through and one at the end. We ask that if you have any questions, there's actually a Q&A button that you'll see on your screen, and to put your questions in there, and then we will go through those with the help of Eric when we reach that point of the presentation. Next slide. So just to make sure everyone's here for the right thing, we are here on how to request a COVID-related reasonable accommodation. Next slide, please. I am Staci Converse. I am the managing attorney for our developmental disabilities program at Disability Rights Maine, and I will let my co-presenters introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Mark Joyce. I am the managing attorney and director of the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness program in the DRM.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Simonne Maline, and I work as the executive director of the Consumer Counsel System of Maine. I also serve as the chair for the advisory board for the mental health program at Disability Rights Maine. And I'm glad to be here with all of you today.
Hi everybody, I'm Mark Orlando. I represent the Bangor chapter of Speaking Up For Us. I also represent Speaking Up For Us on their statewide board of directors.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Here is all of our contact information. If you would like to reach us, or encourage you to take a look at our websites. Next slide. A reminder just to be counted. It's census season right now, and we have a specially designed website about all the important reasons why it's important to participate in the census, especially for persons with disabilities. This is just a general disclaimer, just so everyone knows this webinar is being recorded and will be made public. So don't share any information that you don't want to be made public. This presentation and the materials that go along with it are only intended to provide you with information about requesting a reasonable accommodation. Nothing in this presentation should be considered legal advice, and we are not creating an attorney-client relationship through the presentation of this information. So.
Yes, I know people are kind of getting sick of hearing about COVID in the news, and I understand, but it kind of bears repeating that just because we're sick of it doesn't mean COVID is sick of us.
Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, we are on the correct slide. And you know, COVID is an illness caused by a virus. It spreads from person to person and makes people really, really sick. And sometimes it's also called coronavirus, novel coronavirus, and a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why is this different, Marco? Why, you know, people get sick all the time. Why is this so special that we're doing a special presentation on it?
Well, COVID is not something that we have seen the likes of before. There's currently no cure for it. There's currently no vaccine. It can make people very sick. People have died from COVID. Last I checked, over 150,000 have died in the United States so far since this pandemic began back in March. It's easy to catch even when other people don't look or feel sick. Some people can be asymptomatic to COVID.
Next slide, please.
And because of this, Some new rules have come up. Some provider agencies have been trying to be proactive, trying to nip it in the bud before it becomes too much of a problem. They may have good intentions, they may mean well, but some of these new rules have changed the way that services have been provided, and it's been hard for some people to get the services that they need because of those new rules.
And so we're going to ask the audience, if you wouldn't mind at this point, what are some new rules that folks have seen that have been related to COVID? And if you would mind putting a comment in the chat box if you have a rule, and we can share those with everyone. Yep, wearing a mask. Yep, everywhere there are masks. I think that's been one of the biggest rules we've seen, social distancing. Not meeting in person. No, funny that this one's there. No, no extra people allowed in medical appointments. Not being able to gather in large groups. Testing before being admitted. Okay. Well, I thank you so much for all of those. And so we will just start going through how to request a reasonable accommodation, which is why you all are here. Sometimes rules are called policies, practices, or procedures. This is the example we came up with, and you're going to be seeing this one throughout the presentation. We'll talk about it. This is an example of a new rule, only patients at doctor's appointments. And the rationale that we've been told is to keep everyone safe during COVID. So, sometimes rules are called policies, practices, or procedures, as we have mentioned. Here's an example of another rule. Do you want to share this one with folks, Marco?
Sure. Rent is due on the 1st of each month, and most landlords or whoever, they'll say this is a rule, this is a standard rule. If I don't get rent payments, I will go out of business.
Next slide, please. So if a provider has a new rule or some other organization has a new rule that make it hard for you to get the services you need, you might be able to ask for reasonable accommodation. Marco, what's a reasonable accommodation?
Well, a reasonable accommodation is when you need a rule or something else modified so that you get fair treatment because of your disability.
Awesome. Next slide, please. Now we're going to go through the steps for asking for a reasonable accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
So
we'll start at the bottom here. Ask yourself, why might I need an exception to a certain rule?
Next slide. So rule number 1 that we went over, only patients at doctor's appointments. You might need an exception to this rule to have a supporter come with you to the doctor's office because of your PTSD is one reason.
We're talking hypothetically here at this point.
And the second rule is rent is due at the 1st of the month. Marco, why might you need an exception to that one?
Well, I may have other expenses that come up, like a car payment, for instance.
Next slide. Ask for an exception to the rule. That's step number 2.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step before even getting to a reasonable accommodation is really just ask, whoever is telling you the rule, if there can be an exception made for them. You don't have to use any fancy language. You don't have to even talk about it being an accommodation. So just ask whether or not you can bring someone with you to the doctor's office, for example.
Mhm.
Next slide. Same thing with the rent. If you want to pay less, you know, just ask if you can pay it later or pay it at different times. But we're talking about the situation where someone says no, that the rule can't be changed for you. Next slide.
So this is where we really got to ask ourselves, am I going to need an exception to this rule because of my disability?
Next slide. So the first example, I need a supporter to come to the doctor's office with me because of my PTSD related to trauma at a previous doctor's appointment. That seems pretty clearly related to my disability.
Mhm.
The second one, where I need my landlord to let me skip this month's rent payment because I don't have the money so I can get my car fixed, probably is not related to my disability.
No.
These, we have purposely given you incredibly black and white examples of what seems to be related to your disability and what doesn't. But in most cases, these won't be as black and white. There's a lot of gray area.
Yeah, lots of gray area.
So if the answer is yes, if you need an exception because of your disability, then you can ask for a reasonable accommodation. And so we have reached the portion of the presentation that Marco and I were presenting, and so we wanted to stop and take any questions that you might have. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and Eric, who is handling all of our technical issues, will read them to me. And
you'll have to expect a delay as people type.
okay.
The first one comes in as, what constitutes a disability?
Mark, I see you joined us. Did you have an answer for that one?
Oh, well, there's, in order to keep it sort of straightforward and not get into the weeds, it is a number of things. One is that you are substantially limited in a major life activity. I don't want to get into the legal weeds. It is, if you are substantially limited in these major life activities, that is, like, for example, working is a major life activity. So in certain contexts, like say for housing, in other places, if you received Social Security disability because of your disability, many times that will be enough to, you know, show that you have a disability. But it is dependent upon the person and the specific circumstance. But there are a number of ways to fit within that particular protected. What they call it a protected class, and that is how one of the ways you fit in. There are a number of them, but I'll just stick with the big one for now.
Okay. The next question from Cody. Will you be able to address reasonable accommodations in regard to admittance into an inpatient hospitalization placement?
So thank you for that question. The training is really intended to provide general information on how you can ask for reasonable accommodation in sort of any place you want. I don't think we're specifically going to use that example, but the tools that are provided in this training will be transferable to many situations.
Okay, and in the chat from Charles, will lack of stimulus payments affect the rules regarding paying rent or other bills?
I would just say that I think it would be very difficult if there wasn't and this is a sort of a legal term, nexus between your disability and the accommodation you're looking for. So I think that's one of the reasons. And we're doing this. This is a very this is like a very overview sort of training. Our hope is to do other trainings for more specific areas because the reasonable accommodation area is so gray and there's so many different things. So I would say you would use the same analysis for every question. And so the grayer the analysis or the further away the analysis becomes for whether it's disability related or not, is the less of a chance it's going to be successful.
Okay, that's everything we currently have for
All right.
questions.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Marco and I will turn it over to Mark and Simonne to do the next section.
So the next slide will be in the latter, I'd imagine. Yes, is step 4 is get ready to make the request again. In the other steps, it's just sort of making the request without doing it as a reasonable accommodation, right? I mean, so what we're trying to say is try and just have a conversation before you get to the actual making of an accommodation. And Simonne, why do you think that's important to start with that sort of back and forth rather than just jumping right into asking for an accommodation?
I think it's really important, you know, reasonable accommodations is a legal request. So before you go to the legal route, you may just try asking your provider, whoever it is that you are asking for an accommodation, just in an informal way first, to ask if there can be ways around what you need when you need it. And so you may not have to go through this, you know, formal process. And I think any time that you can, it saves time and energy and stress and all of those things if you can get your needs met without having to go through a reasonable accommodation request. But it's here if you need it.
So the next slide. Okay, so here it is, you're getting ready to make the request again. This time you're asking for the rule change as a reasonable accommodation. Include information to show how your request is related to your disability and making the connection for the organization. And I think that's really important because sometimes folks don't understand how something is connected to your disability. And so it's sometimes viewed as an exception for you as special treatment, which it isn't. It's your right under the law. So I think it's very important to understand that you're not asking for any sort of special favor, is that you are saying, look, in order for me to have the same access to this as somebody else who doesn't have a disability, we just need you to have a change in the rule that I'm asking for. And I think it's important not to look at it, Simonne, as a favor, because I think it might hold some people back because they'll feel bad. Do you agree?
Yeah, because, you know, there's a whole power differential that we didn't necessarily put into the PowerPoint. But, you know, when you're asking a provider, they sort of, you know, they have some power, whether to say yes or no. And, you know, and it can get really awkward or intimidating to, you know, asking someone who you might see as someone that has control or power in your life. And it can get intimidating. Mark, can you say why saying the words reasonable accommodations is really important?
Yeah, so we're going to get to that in a couple more slides as well.
Okay,
And there we go.
right.
But I mean, it's good to bring it up now because it can't be said too often. The law does not require you to say those words, but when you say those words, it helps your case for making sure there's no misunderstanding as to what you're asking for. And so we'll get to that in a second, but I think that's very important, Simonne, to bring that up early because the words reasonable accommodation have legal meaning. So next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go into his request related to your disability. And we're back to the friend scenario, bringing a friend with you, and know that is against the rules. So the next slide. Okay, so Simonne, what do you think about this not black and white issue?
Well, it really isn't black and white because say I wanted to have somebody with me because I wanted the company in the waiting room while I wait. That isn't necessarily related to my disability. But because when I make a request, because it is related, as someone that does have PTSD and often related to medical appointments, I might ask for an accommodation to have somebody with me because it is directly related to my disability. So sometimes the reason why you need it might be disability related or not, and then that helps determine whether it's a reasonable accommodation.
And I'd like to point out that this sort of slide is the hardest to make because everything is so fact specific to the individual. So while we're saying to make a point that the above is different than the below in terms of relating to your disability, there may well be a disability related need for someone to have a friend that they need to talk to while they're in the waiting room. So when we're trying to show these differences about if it's related to or not related to your disability, these examples are not examples of for sure. They're just the best we can come up with because almost anything might be related to a person's disability, particularly in terms of mental health needs, where it's, and this comes up an awful lot, is that when people can't see a disability, sometimes they just don't, think about it. And even though the law allows you to ask for that same accommodation because it is a disability like any other disability under the law. So, but I wanted to make that point that the above could well be, if depending upon a certain situation. So these are very difficult slides to make because of that sort of individualized assessment when you're making the determination whether or not it relates to your disability. Next slide. We're going up the ladder. So now comes the request for the accommodation.
So there's lots of ways that you can ask for a reasonable accommodation. You can ask somebody directly on a phone or a video phone. You can ask them to write it for you. You can yourself do it in writing, and you can have someone else ask for you. So say for whatever your reason is, you can't ask, but you have a guardian or a family member or a close friend that kind of helps you navigate and advocate, and they can make that request for you. And you don't, as we said, we're going to say it again, you don't have to use the special words reasonable accommodation, but those words do have a legal meaning, and they may help you in if it gets confusing, if you're saying, hey, I need a favor, or you don't use the words reasonable accommodation. This helps clarify that this is a legal request.
Okay, so we have put together a form, and this is the actual form. It's a one-page form, and we've put it on our website. And the reason we did this form, and I'll just go over it, is to let folks have an ability to make sure that the place where they're requesting the accommodation really knows that what they're asking for, because sometimes you'll see can be confusion. Are you asking for an accommodation? Are you not asking for an accommodation? Are you at the stage where we're just trying to work it out informally? This really then would sort of helps to trigger the beginning process. And so I'll just take a look at this in terms of, it's very brief. It just has the name of the provider or agency, and it's from your name, your address, telephone number, and your email if you have one. And then it's just, this is the accommodation I'm asking for. And in this one, when you say the accommodation I'm asking for, you don't need to overthink it. You know what you need. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been doing this for a long time. The people who know what they need the best are the people who are making the request themselves. I may miss something in terms of what you need. You are the person who knows your life the best. So don't think, and this happens, don't think, well, they can't do it anyway, or I'm not going to put something they can't do. Don't worry about that. What is your need? And then you write that out, and I'll get to the bottom where if you can't write it out, there's a checkbox for you to be able to request it. And then so the accommodation you're asking for. And then it's, I'm asking for this accommodation because. And now this can get to why your disability, why it's disability related. Because you're saying, because I need this. An easy example is the parking space example of an individual who has a mobility impairment, and they do not have the apartment complex they live in doesn't have reserved spots. And so they say, I need a reserved spot. Why? Because I have a mobility impairment and I can't get from far away to the apartment complex. So you sort of make the connection between your disability and what you're asking for. It's also extremely important to understand, this is the first step. You do not have to put in what your specific disability is, okay? In terms of you were going to have to make the connection eventually or at the beginning, but like, for example, you could say, due to my mental health disability. You don't have to say, due to my diagnosis of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, this begins and I'll get to it in a second, what they call the interactive process. So, which is essentially just starting the conversation. So if they need more information, it starts the conversation. But those are the two main things. What do you need, and why do you think it's related to your disability, essentially, in terms of why you're asking for it. And now this box down here says that if this box is checked, I am making this request orally and am asking that you write down my request for me. Technically, this is another accommodation request within this accommodation request. So you'll find sometimes folks have an easier time saying things to people, telling them what they need, from inside talking rather than writing it all out. So checking this box, you're essentially asking for another accommodation for them to write it out for you. And then the last part is that you are asking that if the request is denied, that they provide you the reasons for the denial in writing within 5 days of receiving the request. And the reason for that is to avoid miscommunication. I think one of the things you'll find that I've found over the years is a lot of problems could be solved early on if a communication problem that happened at the beginning was addressed at the outset. And so the written is really important. So can you think of anything else, Simonne, to add to that?
Well, I think it's important to say you don't have to use this form if
right.
it ends up overwhelming you, or if that's the barrier. The most important thing is making the request, whether it's verbal or on a piece of note paper. This is a guide to help if you are struggling with what should I put in, but this is no means like you have to use this form or you can't ask for a request. So whatever works, we're just trying to give everybody tools in order to make this easier.
Mark?
Yep.
We have a question specific to this from Camilla. Does this form have to have a doctor's signature?
Okay, that's a great question. The answer is no. The requirement for, so in terms of the legal process, you are making the request. If the people who you're making the request to are saying, you know what, you don't come within that protected class, you don't come within this law, I believe you don't come within this law because I don't believe you have a disability, I want a doctor's note. Then they can tell you that, and then it would be me, I'd say, no, that's too overbroad. I believe we have provided sufficient evidence say by a Social Security letter or whatever, that this person has met the requirements of the law. At that point, the organization makes a determination whether or not they believe they are not violating the law or violating the law, and then go from there. I mean, it comes down to if there are disagreements as to whether or not the law is being followed. That's why you have courts, right? So there's no black and white. Now, if sometimes it's easier for folks to say, can I just get a doctor's note? I mean, if you look in certain assistant animal cases, sometimes it's easier to get a form that has a doctor signing off on it. But in that case, I think it's really important to understand the fact you do not have to have all the specificities of your disability laid out for a note in order for you to make an accommodation request and for order for the accommodation request to be granted. And again, it's a individualized assessment, so it's going to be different for different people. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and we have a second question again about this form from Melissa saying, the form says that the people you make the request to have to respond within 5 days of receiving my request. How will they know that they have to legally respond and within that time frame?
Well, so that's a really good question. We put the time frame in because to avoid the situation where the person ignores the request. So that, again, and this is you're starting a conversation here. They have an obligation to engage in you if they have any questions. So if they get it, they say, hey, I need more than 5 days. I got some questions. Do I need a doctor's note? Do I have a question about this? They need to have a conversation with you. It's called the interactive process. The 5 days is not in statute or law. The issue really is what's called a constructive denial. And that is when somebody just ignores your request. And so they can't, the law then says, well, you can't ignore a request and then say, hey, I never denied it. I never said anything. The law, after a certain period of time, the law looks at that as what they call a constructive denial. So we're just putting an expectation of the 5 days. Certainly there is actually no law that says after 5 days it's a no, but it does give an idea of what the person is seeking, because a lot of times the accommodations really need to be looked at more quickly than some other than others. But so there is not a real set time frame, but it is to make people aware that that they need to respond or not, and then take the consequence of having it looked at as a denial.
Mark, this is Simonne. I just also want to say that I think also for direct care workers, they often will not know what to do with a reasonable request, accommodation request. So I think in that case, I would, if somebody doesn't know what to do with it, I'd say go talk to your supervisor. It's not our job to figure that out for people, but in seeing Melissa's question, I also realized that often the person we're going to hand this to is somebody that really may not understand what a reasonable accommodation actually is.
Well, and that's a good point, Simonne. So if you look at a number of the Maine Human Rights Commission conciliation agreements, when claims are brought against them, you will usually find in most of them, if not all of them, that entities that have not instituted a policy about how to deal with reasonable accommodations are agreed to institute such a policy. So it might, we're not giving any legal advice to anybody, but if you don't have a policy around how you deal with reasonable accommodations, you would take the chance that a reasonable accommodation is going to be given to one of your employees and not acted upon, and then act as a constructive denial. But that's up to each organization to decide amongst themselves how they want to handle these things.
Mark, a question from Darlene. Can this form be completed by a case manager or guardian?
Well, so you can request an accommodation on behalf of somebody else, but you have to make sure that it's what the person wants, right? So for example, if somebody doesn't want to go somewhere, says, no, I'd rather just stay home and read and paint, and so your guardian makes an accommodation that they be given a a cab ride right to some place where they don't want to go. Yeah, you could make that on their behalf, but it would not be viewed as a denial if the person didn't want that to begin with. So that is the, you know, it's the, and Simonne, you can speak to this in terms of, it's all about the individual's need. It's the accommodations made on their behalf. So go ahead.
Yeah, if someone's making it on your behalf, it should be what your want and need is, not their, then that no longer is a reasonable accommodation if it's not what you want or need and it's somebody else's agenda, not yours.
In fact, we'd probably be making a reasonable accommodation to that person to stop that. So anyway, is there anything else?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Nothing specific to this form.
Okay. So now the step 6 is after you make the request, it's been requested, you're at the top of the ladder. And next slide. Okay, so, and we've covered a lot of this already, so, but we can, you know, just go over it again. After the request is made, the organization might say, yes, we can provide that accommodation. They might say, no, we can't provide the accommodation, and they might not respond at all. The next slide.
And a no, not responding at all is essentially a no, correct?
Yep, not responding at all can be, so for example, not responding can be looked at as a constructive denial, but again, it gets to the specifics of the facts. I mean, if you didn't send the letter in, if you did send the letter in and, you know, the mail was stolen, I mean, that's going to be a different thing than if you just didn't respond. So again, that's a good point, Simonne. I want people to think about this not in terms of this legalese thing, but in terms of, like, if you can't give the accommodation immediately, or you don't think it can happen, talk to the person, try and work something out, because one of the key things, and it's talked about in other accommodation trainings, is that just because you cannot give the accommodation the person is looking for does not mean that your obligation is over. It means you still have the obligation to think if there were alternatives that were within your power to grant sort of substantively what the person is looking for that might not be exactly what the person asked for. Perfect example is the parking space example earlier. So you might not be able to give the actual parking space, but you might have a shuttle that could go pick up the person at the further space and bring them. So if you have that ability, but you say, hey, I can't give you the space, I don't, you know, I meet one of these defenses, that doesn't stop it.
Another great, oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, I just want to say that doesn't stop just because you can't do the initial one does not stop your obligation to think if there's another way you can still meet the person's needs. Go ahead, Simonne.
Like, for example, I was thinking, like, I may not, for some reason, I may not be able to have somebody in my appointment, but I may be okay with using video chat on my phone, and that for me might work. And that's an example of a way that, you know, your request might have been to have somebody in person, but if you could take that person on video with your phone, would that work and also meet the requirement of the no extra person? That's another way that you could maybe get your needs met, but it's different. But the conversation hopefully will help uncover some of those potential alternatives that might be okay for me or whoever's asking for the reasonable accommodation.
And you know that dovetails perfectly, Simonne, into this particular slide in terms of the defenses. Okay, so even though you've already made the accommodation request, it's related to your disability, and everything is a-okay from all the previous slides. You're like, great. There still is there's still legal reasons why that can be denied. And these are the three main ones. Is that one is called a fundamental alteration. And so these are the legal terms. Fundamental alteration means I'm running a business for housing, apartment building. if I don't get rent, that's a major fundamental alteration to my business. So it's an accommodation of not paying rent. That is going to be a good defense for me. It is too hard or it costs too much. That's the undue burden. And this is this one I think, and Simonne's example is a perfect example of this. So say the individual can do the video phone, but doesn't have a video phone, doesn't have an iPad, doesn't have these things, and says, you know, you can't allow the person to come in with me. I'm okay with an iPad to do it. I don't have an iPad. Well, then the organization are they responsible then for buying an iPad and giving it to the person to use during their appointment? Maybe, maybe not. And I think, you know, if they're going to use the saying it costs too much because we'd have to do that for everyone, or it costs too much, those things again are individualized assessments. It might cost too much for an individual who's a solo practitioner, but it might not be too much for, you know, Anthem, right? So it depends really a lot of times on, it's the undue burden or undue financial burden specific to the provider of the service. So that's another sort of individualized assessment. The last one is the one that I think the COVID really touches on the most. It's called the direct threat. And when they say direct threat, they mean essentially there's a legitimate safety concern for the accommodation. So, you know, one of the things that I always tell folks is that it's not just that there's a direct threat, it's that it can't be reduced with another accommodation request. And I always use this example, and I'll use it here when I do these talks, is it's on a continuum. Because there's never 100% safety, or, you know, you're always going to have some risk, right? So if you had on a continuum, if you took, say, a child or a toddler and put them in a room, in a house by themselves, where would you think on that level of risk, no risk, overwhelming risk, that child would be? Well, most people would say, boy, overwhelming, alone, knives, sticking their finger in a socket, the whole 9 yards. It's like, that is overwhelming risk. You take parents, you put them in the same place, the house, the same people, the child, then where's the risk on that particular continuum? It goes all the way down. Most people would say all the way down to close to, not zero, but it goes down. So you think of the reasonable accommodation as the parents in that particular argument that it's too risky. Yeah, it's too risky to have a 2-year-old alone in a home. It's not too risky to have a 2-year-old with the accommodation of parents. So you have to take a look at where that lands in the continuum. And that's why the direct threat issue is always going to be the most grayest. It's gray, because of that sort of continuum. And that's what you're going to find with the COVID-19 issues. So if people have questions about specific, can I do this, can I do that? We're not going to say yes or no, because you need to look at the specific, and you need a lot of information as to making that assessment as to whether or not that particular defense is going to be adequate when someone asks for an accommodation like that. So, anything else, Simonne, to add to that?
Oh, good.
And the next slide. And then what if they say no? Ask for the reasons in writing, but I want to echo what Simonne said, that if you don't want to use the form, don't use the form. Just, you know, you can ask for the reasons in writing by saying, I want the reasons in writing. You know, so, and then as we've been saying, just keep communicating. You know, communication is the key to see if these things can be worked out.
Mark, why is it important to get things in writing?
Well, so that people don't, that you know where people's positions are. And that so that there won't be any miscommunication. So if somebody says, well, they denied me this accommodation for X, and you say, well, the other side, the provider, whoever says, no, we didn't do that. Well, if you don't have a writing as to what happened, it's just going to be back and forth, and it doesn't do anybody any good.
Okay.
So next slide. And then the next step. So Simonne, what would people do once this happens at the end?
Hello, Mark. I have been denied my reasonable accommodation request. Can you help me?
And so that's that. They get all the information, and then you call us essentially. And so we take a look at all of these cases, not just the COVID cases, right? I mean, and this I want to make clear is that the analysis for reasonable accommodation is the same for anything. COVID-19 issues, parking lot issues and housing, I mean, it's almost the same exact sort of assessment. And so when we have folks calling to say, I asked for this, I didn't get it, then we do that analysis, we gather the information. So there's no like black and white answer because it's so individualized. So the next step, next slide. Oh, this is really important. This is hugely important.
Yeah.
No retaliation. So your provider can't try to talk you out of asking for a reasonable accommodation. They can't treat you badly if you ask for a reasonable accommodation. The rules protect anyone who helps you ask for a reasonable accommodation. And here's the most important part. Even if your accommodation request would not be seen by any court as being reasonable, you can still be retaliated for even asking for it. So even if
And we
you
know
think
it
it's unreasonable-
happens, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, it happens. Well, I've had cases where it's happened. And so we just want to make sure that folks know that retaliation in and of itself, regardless of what you're being retaliated for, is a rights violation. So next slide. Just re-echoing this, that they're not reasonable accommodations, aren't favors, not special treatment, they're a legal right. Always ask for what you need. It's better to ask and be denied than never to have asked at all. But this is important because a lot of folks are just so beat down, right? And so then when it's like, well, geez, I need this. It's like, well, I don't want to ask for it. They're telling me it's a special treatment. Nobody else gets it. Look, it's not special treatment. It's your legal right. You know, so if somebody at the place where you live or a provider or whatever, if they sent away their taxes and supposed to get a return and they didn't get it, they'd say, hey, I have a legal right to that. That's not a favor. And so they would never think it's a favor. It's the same thing. You have a legal right to that. It's not a favor. So I just, want to echo that because we do have folks who, understandably think, oh, it's a favor. It's not. It's your legal right.
I have this, same thing with people that often say, I don't want to bother. They said no, and I can just go on and on with the examples that I've heard from folks in the community. And I get that. If you've been disenfranchised, you don't feel like you have a lot of power. When somebody says no to you, it's so easy just to stop right there and think, I'm done. There's no recourse. I don't have any power or anything. And that's what we're trying to also help folks know is that you do. And I know it's super hard, standing up for yourself is not easy. So I will always say, talk to your friends, talk to your fellow peers, even if it's not DRM, Disability Rights Maine, get somebody to help you with this, because we understand. I just want to say that. I just feel like that heart piece is that, it's really hard to stand up for yourself and ask for what you need, but it's really, really important.
Right, and we have several questions waiting if you're ready.
Sure.
All right, first being, if clear masks are considered a reasonable accommodation, what do we do if the business claims they cannot or will not provide this? To clarify, the business states they cannot find the mask for those who are requesting it.
So like we said at the beginning, we're not going to give legal advice on specific sort of issues. Or what we would say is that masks would be treated like all reasonable accommodation issues. So if you had a disability where you could not wear a mask and you went someplace and they would not allow you in, then basically you could call us with the specifics, and we would do the assessment as we've done with any reasonable accommodation as to whether or not, you know, that it's related to your disability, whether that they didn't have a defense, whether they didn't offer you something that would have been would have met your needs, all those things. And so it really depends upon the specific facts of the situation. So it'd be the same analysis. So you know, I know a lot of folks have specific questions about things and about specific things that are happening, but we just it's beyond the scope of this particular training to get into those specifics. But we do have an intake, call intake. We review every single case that comes in regarding any type of thing that might be an accommodation request.
And I would just add that we also have an intake form online. So if you want to do it that way too, there's another way to do it. So you can check that out.
Okay. Next question. Because of appointments occurring remotely, providers are not developing plans and paperwork during meetings, despite having access to the electronic systems necessary to do so. This results in delays and unnecessary back and forth. This is more of a practice than policy. Can this still be addressed as an accommodation, especially if the disability involves communication and processing differences?
Okay, so just in terms of the specifics, we won't get into specifics, but reasonable accommodations are, you're asking for exceptions, policies, practices, or procedures. They don't have to be written down. They don't have to be, you know, a person's in the policy manual. It can be, because you'll see a number of practices that are not in any sort of written form. And so yeah, you can ask for an accommodation of anything that you believe is a practice. And then again, like if you use this form, you get back what it is they're saying that they would do or not do, or ask, you know, as an accommodation, whatever you're seeking. But yeah, no, it doesn't have to be in a policy manual.
Okay, and then Lauren and Sue both have questions regarding disclosure. How specific does the person need to be about the disability or diagnosis? Do they need to show proof of accommodation is necessary? Or if the provider has a release form of their own, do they have to disclose all disabilities or only those related to the accommodation request?
I'll answer that one, no. Okay, the release form it would be very problematic in my opinion, of a generalized release form like that. So the issue is you need to give the information necessary for the provider or the person you're asking for the accommodation to determine whether or not you are an individual with disability and have a disability-related need for that service, for that accommodation. So, and when I say disability-related need, I don't mean, you know, that there has to be this sort of like overwhelming. It's like, it's a perfect example is this, is that when we do service emotional support animal forms, you'll see, you will have attached to it just a definition of disability, right? And then you'll have a doctor signing saying that I've looked at that, this person has a disability. And then below that, they will say why they think there is a connection between the disability and the need for the animal. So for example, you can have a disability-related need for an animal to get outside, to walk, right? Well, that can be related to, say, if you need exercise due to a cancer diagnosis, or if you need to, you know, to get out and meet people, right? So you don't have to say, this person has cancer, this person has schizophrenia. You just have to, and so this is a problem. I just want to say that you don't have to sign these releases to ask for the accommodation. So, but it does, if there's an issue, then you go back and forth. They can say, I don't have enough information. Fine, let's take a look to see if you're asking too much or you're not asking, you know, sort of, again, it's individualized.
Okay.
And certainly just want to echo, like, you don't have to talk about other disabilities that aren't related to your accommodation, none of that, so.
Okay, another specific question, but if you have anything to add, Camilla asks, what if they state it's company policy and you can go somewhere else, i.e. going into Walmart to get supplies, but you can't wear a mask due to medical reasons? Can they legally deny you?
Well, again, you'd go through the assessment of whether or not, like we just talked about, is it disability related? If you're asking for an accommodation to their policy, that is, if they offer you any other accommodations, do they have any defenses to it? So again, it's very fact specific. So whether it's masks or whether it's service animals or whether it's parking spaces or whether it's, I've done ones where the accommodation has been Section 8 vouchers to get them extended because of certain disability related needs of people being in the hospital. So it's so fact specific that we really can't give any sort of idea as to whether or not something would be legal or not legal. We would just say that if you do think you have an accommodation sort of issue here, and you asked and it was denied, we look at all of these issues when they come through intake as to whether it's something that we would be able to take or not.
And again, I would just reiterate, using the form, getting the reason in writing will be incredibly helpful through sort of the whole process. So we have it really nailed down why your request was denied.
Okay, from Carrie, what types of issues have you been seeing related to COVID-19? Is it mostly mask related?
Well, I mean, I would say that the issues really are changes in policies that had been not changed, the unwritten changes in how people are having their rights affected. So, for example, you'll see a visitation problem. Visitation has come up in terms of, can an individual visit? Can I go and visit and come back? And again, you have to look at each individualized case as to, for example, if a person wants to visit somebody in an ICU who is medically compromised, right? That's a different fact pattern than somebody wanting to visit somebody in an open field, right, who's not medically compromised. So, I mean, those things are, and again, there's no black and white, and it's that continuum, right? Because, so again, I'm not being very helpful in terms of giving specific information about certain cases, but it's a fact-specific analysis that is done regardless of whether it's COVID-19 or other sorts of issues. But the COVID-19, they are subject to, like anything else, reasonable accommodation requests. So I think we only have 1 more minute left, so I think we'll probably wrap it up.
Yeah, this is the last question.
Okay.
And very apropos, is this recording going to be posted on your website?
If all went well, yes, it will be.
Yeah, right. We hope so, yes. We are 99.9% sure. So, we appreciate everyone coming. I see we had 53 participants. That's wonderful. And please, again, I'd echo what Staci had to say about use our form, call us if you want to have an intake. And we thank you, and everybody have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.